Gabar with us, the Director of National Intelligence. It's wonderful to have you here in India, and thank you so much for speaking to us. In terms of the strategic relationship and the intelligence arrangements between India and the United States, to what extent is it premised on perhaps an expansionist or an expanding China and the Asia-Pacific region?
You know, the ties between our two countries, the United States and India, go very, very far back.
Ladies and gentlemen, a very good evening. Starting today, News Night is going to bring to you the unfiltered truth. These are tangible facts and thought-provoking perspectives that actually matter. What we do on the show is that we will unpack big issues shaping India and our world. From the corridors of power to the streets just outside your door, we will be cutting through the noise. We'll dissect the facts. We'll explore what it all means only and only for you. This is News Night, where the headlines meet the hard questions. So the world is in a turmoil, sliding fast into chaos and uncertainty. The Russian and the United States officials have earlier launched talks in Saudi Arabia, and this is about a 30-day partial ceasefire in Ukraine. And you know what happened just before these talks? Ukraine has claimed that Russia launched a barrage of drones that has killed at least 7 people. Russian attacks on Ukraine are escalating, while shaken Europe, in fact, is also growing louder against Russia and Trump's America. What is Trump's America doing? It is fortifying its own power. It is striking the Houthis. It's sources for its own Gaza and the Panama Canal projects. It is slashing the NATO funds and a lot more. In the meantime, the Houthis have also launched several strikes at the Ben Gurion airport in Israel. Look at these dramatic images on your screens. You know what is China doing? China now is rethinking its strategy. It is challenging America's. And in just the last about 60 days or so, you have the US that has held secret Pentagon talks on China. This while Poland has stockpiled essentials, it is bracing for a conflict. Tonight, ladies and gentlemen, News Night delivers the real developing global situation. We'll also examine India's position, India's options, India's stance. We are getting you information, newsmakers, that you would want to know. And even as you look at all this, remember that's happening, clearly in a position like this, you will be looking at critical questions. These are critical questions on top of your mind, and the first big question, we'll get that on our screens now. Could the ongoing Russia-Ukraine conflict actually escalate into a direct confrontation between Russia and NATO? This is the first big question. And at the end of the show, we'll also want to answer this. The other question that we'll deep dive into, what is the risk of a military conflict that could happen between the USA and China over the status of Taiwan? You must have read about this, about the ongoing situation. Let's bring up the third big question. How do tensions in the Middle East that seems to have become this new theater of conflict, particularly Iran and Israel, affect the situation across the globe? This brings us to our next big question on the News Night tonight. How could Turkey's actions in the Middle East ignite a broader conflict involving the USA and Russia? Because there are dramatic images even coming out from there. People are out on the streets. And let's not forget, what is the India picture? What should we in India be thinking about this? What strategic choices would India face in this scenario? What is it that Prime Minister Modi has done so far, and what is it that he will do next in case the scenario unfolds the way it is? And even to decode what is happening on the big picture. So what we'll do before we deep dive into the entire issue is that we'll show you a world map. This world map will help you understand where we are standing globally. Why do we believe that this is a wide landscape? This is just an idea to tell you about what global conflicts, ladies and gentlemen, we are talking about. You're well aware of what's been happening between Russia and Ukraine. We'll bring in our next slide that will tell you more of how this entire theater of conflict has been expanding to China and Taiwan. You also do know that China has been wanting to gain control over Taiwan, something that the USA has already gotten worried. Then all is obviously not well between North Korea and South Korea. This is a real situation there, possibly also getting out of hand. And then let's not forget the Middle East. The Middle East could again be that new theater that you must keep your eyes focused on. When you talk of Lebanon, Israel, Gaza, and this is also where we have seen a lot of action in the last many weeks. This also will tell us more about Yemen there and the US. Remember again, Houthis, there have been, out there on a rampage. We've seen the US, we've seen Donald Trump making it very clear that he will ensure that no terror elements, no rogue elements that do not comply with what Donald Trump says will be allowed to prosper. And there's a lot of conversation of a deal possibly that Donald Trump is also striking with a lot of other players. So if you look at even Haiti, there have been conflicts here, there have been civilian crises, people have been out on the streets calling again for better measures, for hold of their resources and much more. So if you look at the big picture, and then is the Israel-Iran conversation that we just spoke about. Again, all is not well in this global conflict. China, let's not forget the dragon in the room, quite literally. Now you're looking at China and the Philippines, again, they're locked in a lot of dispute. The Red Sea, again, there is an issue of conflict that we've seen and discussed time and again. And if we again try to take a big global picture, you will also be looking at the other players here. The other player here is South Sudan. So do not forget that it's not just the Russia-Ukraine war that you must be worried about or be thinking about. You're also looking at a lot of these countries, a lot of these spaces where you have this ongoing conflict going on. Pakistan, the neighbor that India obviously needs to deal with, but Afghanistan, ever since the Taliban there has come into rule, you're seeing a lot of that proxy terror that continues unabated, and we'll get you a whole world picture to tell you that all the areas that you will see highlighted are essentially also areas where you have the global conflicts that continue, right from the USA to Russia. So that is where the theater of conflict today revolves around. But if you wonder, is this the only issue that should bother us? What we'll try to do now is to rewind into history. Because when you go back into history, you realize that there are a lot of lessons. There are a lot of patterns that we will be thinking about, and those patterns will go up here. These are lessons that one can learn and infer from what's happened during World War I and World War II. Now, during the World War I, that is 1914 to 1918, is where you had the powder keg model. What was the trigger? Why did the World War I even happen? The real trigger there was the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand in 1914. But, ladies and gentlemen, the people say the real fuel was a web of a lot of alliances that started turning into a mess, that started turning against each other. So what is the parallel? Why should we be talking about what happened during the World War I? The parallel today is that there are still a lot of those alliances that exist, that you see largely stabilized in the world over, where it's about the NATO and the Russia ties with China, the informal blocs in the Middle East. So you still have a lot of these parallels that could be drawn, and that is why, if you look at history, you possibly can understand where is the world going ahead. Let's fast forward to World War II. During 1939 to 45 is where essentially this was the ideological clash, the fight for the ideologies. What was the trigger for the Second World War? You had Germany's invasion of Poland. Hitler's expansionism, something I'm sure that a lot of you are already aware about. History books are replete with such references to Japan's imperial ambitions, something that triggered the Second World War. What is the parallel today is again something that you see on your screens. There is inequality, not just economic, but on a lot of other fronts, to sanctions that has led to some kind of resentment and also China's push to reclaim Taiwan. So this is why, if you look at what really has happened during both World War I and World War II, what are we looking at? What does the future hold for us? Clearly, when you look at all these details, I want to also think about what possibly could happen in today's day and time. Today's day and time, when we are here in India, bringing you this broadcast, what has Prime Minister Modi said? Because the Prime Minister said India is not neutral. For the longest time, what was the biggest blame that was pinned on India? That India is neutral. India can't take a stand. But Narendra Modi said, no, we are not neutral. We stand for peace. And peace, he said, is our stand. So what really are the strengths vis-a-vis India, vis-a-vis New Delhi, vis-a-vis Narendra Modi? Let's bring that up for you. How will India navigate this entire crisis, this theater of conflict that you see around you? There are essentially three things that we believe will largely be defining and redefining the India story. The first is diplomacy. And you've seen the Prime Minister stressing on diplomacy instead of the use of any kind of force. Do remember, India is never the aggressor. India is not belligerent. Then there is a lot of strategic autonomy. So India believes in not non-alignment, but this is a strategic autonomy where you keep your interest above anything else, and that is how you decide your foreign policy. To leveraging the global growing influence that India today has. Let's not forget, you've seen the Prime Minister always going that extra mile to ensure that he is able to connect with a lot of those world leaders. So how exactly has India been dealing with this situation is also something that is of interest to us. When it comes to Narendra Modi, now Narendra Modi has always engaged with the world leaders directly. Whether this is Trump, whether this is Putin, you've seen the Prime Minister reaching out to all these leaders and time and again saying that this is not the time for war. Also, promoting a multilateral dialogue. New Delhi again has maintained that dialogue is the only way forward. And having good relationship with a lot of these big powers helps you establish a multilateral dialogue, something that is needed in today's day and time, to balancing strategic relationships with major powers. Now, these are major powers like Russia, these are major powers like China, these are major powers also like the USA. So, ladies and gentlemen, it is a fascinating but a very, very important situation that we have decided to deep dive. And I think for every story to be complete, you must have some very spirited and meaningful conversations. And to join us on this edition of the News Night, as we premiere tonight, let me say good evening to Mr. T.S. Tirumurthy, who's been the former ambassador of India to the United Nations. He's also a former secretary to the government of India. He's also right now a distinguished professor at IIT Madras. He's a man who doesn't mince his words, and he's also someone who smiles occasionally. So we'll get him to smile a bit because, there is already so much of stress all around. We are talking of conflicts. When you look at the situation globally, how do you assess for our viewers what really is going on?
No, thank you very much for having me in your show. I think what we are looking at is actually a disintegration of what the West usually refers to as the liberal world order. And the most obvious thing is the impact what President Trump is having. And, I must say that we should not exaggerate what Trump is doing in the second term. At the same time, we should not downplay what he has done in the first term. Because what actually happened is that his successor, President Biden, actually carried forward many of his foreign policy initiatives. So, and President Trump has been quite consistent with what he has been saying right from the beginning about Russia, about EU, about NATO, about China and others. So I think what he could not achieve in the first term is actually taking it forward in the second term. The only difference is now that he has a very good team with him. And of course, there are other challenges like the Ukraine war and the Gaza war. And much is also being made out of this, transactionalism of Trump. Now, yes, there is transactionalism in what he is doing, and it has been a hallmark. But at the same time, let us not underestimate the geopolitical logic of what he is trying to do. See, on the one hand, we have the America First policy of the Trump administration. They've just put out a 2025 trade policy, and it has, they're going to fulfill those what they have set out in expectations in the policy. And they're also going to secure these priorities through use of tariffs as a weapon to balance any unfair advantage. Now, the touchstone is going to be reciprocity, and this touchstone will be applied to friends and foes alike, to developed and developing alike. And on the other hand, when you see the resetting of relations with Russia, it is as much a strategic goal as it is transactional. So what he could not do with Russia in the first term, and I wish he had done this rapprochement in the first term, because Ukraine would not have happened. That's the way I look at it. So, and this rapprochement with Russia is going to be good for India as well. And, he's also, but there are some fine-tuning to do. For example, we see a ceasefire with Russia that is being pursued on the one hand, but he has also given a green light for the ceasefire in Gaza to be violated by Israel. And there is also the logic of a deal with Russia to stabilize Europe. That's what he has said. But we don't have a deal with Iran to stabilize the Middle East. So these are things which he has got to look at. But the important thing is that he's also looking at a deal with China. And that is going to be a major reset around the world. It will have a fallout probably on India as well. So if you juxtapose all this, on the disregard for multilateral bodies and multilateralism which he has, there is bound to be fragmentation, geopolitical, security, economic, but at the end of the day, I think these are still slightly early days, and we'll have to see how it shapes up.
Yes, and I think because you've spoken of the India situation, and a lot of our viewers have been asking us through the day that why has the Prime Minister said that our position is not neutral? Because the Prime Minister said that we are not neutral, we are with peace. So in today's day and time, to be able to take such a bold, a clear and a direct position, how do you see India, sir, really playing a larger role in this entire conflict and the situation?
No, actually, he's very categorically said we are on the side of peace, and that's exactly where we are. But I'm not so sure that we are taking an active role in geopolitical, in fact, the question should be, why has India refrained from getting itself involved in regional and global geopolitics? And, India has been a net contributor for the global commons, for the global public good, like, vaccine Maitri, climate action, and so many other things, including being, digital public infrastructure is another one. So you've done wonderfully there. But in the last 2 decades, I think we have focused entirely on our development and our economy. And this is not just with the NDA, but it's also been with the UPA. So maybe we have convinced ourselves that if we take an active political role or a geopolitical role, then it may affect our growth. Or probably that we feel that if we do that, it may upset our very strong bilateral relations with countries. And it could also be that we feel that maybe the conflicts are best left to the key regional and global players, and we don't want to get involved. And as they say, all of the above may be true. But the point is that India has global ambitions. And, we become we are the 5th largest economy. We are a thriving democracy. We want a UN Security Council permanent seat, and we want to be an important pole in a multipolar world. So the expectations of the international community from us is also increases, and we need to do much more than take a stand or, be a bystander. And if we say in the UN Security Council, for example, that the decisions in the council are not really credible without the participation of the world's largest country, then this logic applies equally to what is outside the UN Security Council.
Absolutely.
And if India can speak both to Russia and Ukraine, for example, should we not be on the high table? So the flip side also for not taking an active role is that we are leaving or ceding the space to countries like Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, to tackle the conflicts around us. So I think it's important, and it's also equally important, by the way, that US does not ignore us. You recall that they ignored us when it came to Afghanistan.
Correct.
They ignored us in Bangladesh. So I think there is definitely a case for doing it. And also, I just want to add one more point.
So,
given our adversarial relationship with, China, this is not going to vanish anytime soon. So it is important to strengthen our alignments with our friends in theaters which are outside our region.
Okay.
So I think, I'm not saying we have to be a mediator in the conflict or pass messages. And you recall, in the Korean War in 1951-52, when we were in the Security Council, we were actually doing very well, not as a mediator, but as a very important player. And we became chair of the Neutral Nations Repatriation Committee in recognition. So that's what I have in mind. And I think it's time India stepped up. And frankly, if they do that, they will protect our, it will protect our interest. And we will provide the leadership which the world desperately needs.
Okay.
And we have leaders in our country which can provide that leadership.
Ambassador Tirumurthy, for your time and perspective, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
But what really remember is the Trump plan. Does Trump even have a plan is what a lot of people have been asking. And then what is New Delhi really going to be doing? So we'll push those two questions ahead, questions that have been sent by a lot of our viewers. We have Harsh V. Pant joining us, who's, remember, a professor. He's also the vice president at the Studies and the Foreign Policy at Observer Research Foundation. Harsh, it's always a pleasure to have you on the show. You're making a debut on the Newsnight. Now tell me something, Harsh. When you look across the world today, there are so many theaters of conflict. How many such theaters should worry us?
I think, Deepti, we live in such an interconnected world that all theaters are in some ways interconnected also. And we have seen how, for example, in one theater, if there is conflict, if there is crisis, it subsequently impacts other theaters. But I think by and large, what we are witnessing today in the world is two major theaters which are kind of at the center of attraction. You have the Ukrainian theater, the Eurasian theater, that you may call it, and the Middle Eastern theater, where at one point it seemed as if we are very close to some kind of a ceasefire, but it has blown up completely. So I think what perhaps one need to ask is that since the Trump administration came in, it came in at the back of this promise that, look, we want to resolve these conflicts. And there is a logic to their approach. They argue, and many in the administration have openly argued, that, look, our focus has to be the Indo-Pacific, our focus has to be China. That's the theater that matters in the long term. Strategically, that's where a new power is rising, that is challenging America, and the center of gravity of global politics, of global economics, has shifted to the Indo-Pacific. So unless America dominates the Indo-Pacific, unless America manages the balance of power transition going on there, many of these conflicts that are happening elsewhere would not matter. So therefore they have to be resolved. So you heard, for example, Elbridge Colby, who is going to join the Defense Department, U.S. Department of Defense, his testimony during his confirmation, he's saying that, look, America cannot compete with the Chinese in the Indo-Pacific, and therefore we have to wrap up many of these conflicts that we are engaged in. Now the question is, do they have a plan to bring these conflicts to an end? Trump administration said that, look, and Mr. Trump himself said that, look, I can conclude these conflicts in a jiffy. I can come and then suddenly they will disappear. And as we know from the last 2 months, it has not been that way. He has struggled to reach to any sort of a consensus between either Ukrainians and the Russians, or between the Israelis and the rest of the region in the Middle East. So I think there are real issues here in terms of his ability to deliver, and his ability to carve out a sort of a coherent narrative around these problems and these challenges that we are witnessing. And this causes a concern, because there was an initial optimism that now that Mr. Trump is here, suddenly we will have greater stability. That is not materializing. Maybe it's too early. Maybe maybe it will take some time. But I think what is also happening is that other actors are playing in. They are jockeying for influence. You have seen Russians, for example, Putin playing it very smartly. He has agreed to some very basic requirements, but by and large, he's fighting on in the battlefield, hoping that the more territory he gains, the better he will be at the negotiating table. Similarly, Netanyahu in Israel has completely challenged America's approach, and maybe he has been given a green signal by the Americans themselves. So I think there are enormous questions today about the conflicts that are raging, and if even the Trump administration might be able to bring them under control. And this raises concerns for countries like India, who are developing countries in many ways, who want to focus on development, who want to focus on economic growth. They are being challenged like never before because their economic growth is under question and global economy is not doing very well. We know that. The numbers are down. The global GDP figures are not very vibrant. And there are pessimism around global economy. And I think at this point in time, if we don't get these conflicts under control, I'm afraid the world looks a rather pessimistic place. And therefore, India is worried and India should be worried.
Okay, now, Harsh, I just want you to push that India point ahead, not just telling us what India can do, India being, the way it is, it has been largely neutral. But, Ambassador Tirumurti was also talking to us a little while earlier, Harsh, and he was of the opinion that India can do far more. Is that also how you concur with that, or you have a different take? Is India doing enough right now?
I think, India is certainly doing a lot more than many perhaps give it credit for. You would recall Mr. Modi, Prime Minister Modi was the first global leader to sit with President Putin and openly say that this is not the time for war. Openly acknowledging that while we may have strong ties with Russia, we also believe that peace is the most important requirement. Similarly, India has told Ukrainians that a political negotiation is needed. Much before any other country, even the Americans, particularly the Americans, came to this conclusion. India was already pushing this argument. So I think in its own way, by mobilizing global public opinion, by being at the heart of this global South, India has done more in this regard than, say, the Chinese. Chinese have been completely quiet. And, here is a country that wants to take the place of America. Here is a country that looks itself as the emerging hegemon. Here is a country that often says that they speak for the global South. But when it was the global South that was being hurt because of food, fuel, fertilizer crisis, because of the Ukraine war, it was India that spoke up. India's G20 agenda was at the heart of, brought all of these issues together. So I think in some ways India has done a lot. Maybe India can do more here. But I think the challenge here is that we have some very difficult relationships to cater to. We have a relationship with Russia, we have a relationship with the West, we have to balance them. We have a relationship with Israel, we have a relationship with the Gulf, with the Arab states in the Gulf, with the Palestinians, we have to balance them. Because we are at a stage where we are focusing on the development, economic development, I think harming any one of these relationships would do great damage to our domestic economic growth story. So it's better to be careful in this regard. But I do think that given the constraints, India has been much more active than perhaps we give India credit for, or we acknowledged, we thought that India would do, say, a decade or even 5 years back. So I think there are changes there. India is, I think, I also heard the ambassador saying that, look, this is the time when global community has expectations from India. I agree. I think global community wants India to do more. They are pitching for India to shape some of these conversations and outcomes. And I think India's argument that it wants to be a leading player in the international system, it doesn't want to be a balancing actor, it wants to lead and shape global outcomes, is in sync with this desire on India's part, and maybe on the part of some of us, that India should be doing much more. But I do think that India is also very critically positioned in many of these issues, and therefore a careful navigation is perhaps good for India at this juncture.
All right. Like they say, never say never. There is clearly a lot more scope to do a lot more things like Harsh you just outlined. Thank you so much for your time and for your perspective here on the Newsnight. So we've got you the facts, we've got you the data. But remember, every show and every story must also be putting out an editorial take. And this is where Newsnight will get to you the bottom line. So what is very clear, ladies and gentlemen, is that the world does stand at a precarious crossroad. There are tensions simmering amongst major powers. Let's talk of the key players. We are talking of Donald Trump. Donald Trump, when you think of Donald Trump, Now, Trump's unpredictability. This is a double-edged sword. Donald Trump's approach, remember, to foreign policy could either diffuse or just ignite global tensions. We do not know. Let's get the next player on our screens. We are talking of Vladimir Putin. Now, Putin's aggression, the spark for escalation that you see when it comes to Russia. Now, Vladimir Putin is the wild card most likely to spark a broader conflict. Viewing NATO and the West as existential threats, he's already shown his willingness to use force in Ukraine, and we shouldn't be surprised. Let's talk of China here, because China's ambitions again is something that you cannot miss. A very, very calculated power play when it comes to China under Xi Jinping is playing a longer game, because they know that they need to survive to fight this long game. Now, Xi Jinping, remember, benefits from global trade, but he also wants China to dominate Asia, actually to be able to counter the US influence. Let's not forget Europe, because Europe right now, people say, is the most vulnerable. It's caught in this crossfire, and Europe is the battleground where tensions could actually explode. The war in Ukraine, don't forget, has already drawn in support from across the continent. And there are countries like Poland and the Baltics that are literally ramping up defenses against Russia, which is the other most critical factor we have spoken about. That is Narendra Modi's role. That is the Bharat's role, India's role. Now, the diplomatic bridge that India's Narendra Modi could be the key to preventing a catastrophe. With India's strategic autonomy, Narendra Modi, remember, maintains ties with both the West and Russia, as seen in a lot of these visits that he's undertaken to Moscow and Kiev. So what is the verdict? Because bottom line, and the show is also about a verdict. The verdict says that this is a real threat, though it is not inevitable. If there are missteps, ladies and gentlemen, in Ukraine, the Indo-Pacific, or just beyond, what that could do is trigger a cascade of escalation. Yet, it is not a foregone conclusion. Now, Narendra Modi's diplomatic balancing act does offer a glimmer of hope, potentially cooling tensions if he can navigate India's own interest, keeping Bharat first. The world's fate then hinges on diplomacy and restraint, because with this absolutely crazy volatile mix, one wrong move could actually light the fuse. But we here at Newsnight will keep you up to speed. Thank you so much for watching. Good night.
Finessa Windows, beautiful and durable designs. इंस्टॉलेशन से मेंटेनेंस की लाइफ लॉन्ग कस्टमर सर्विस। आपके घर में फिनेस्टा नहीं है तो कॉल कीजिए।
Finer Finesta.
I've been reporting on all issues, big and small, from Andhra Pradesh, Telangana, rest of South India, bringing you all the action, all that you need to know, all that you want to know.
The energy of Maximum City is infectious. I bring in that energy in our news coverage from financial capital, Mumbai.
Covering from the southernmost part of India over the last 23 years, I bring in-depth and 360-degree coverage from the Dravidian heartland.
The land of Mishti is also known for its bitter politics. I have seen much water flow under the Howrah Bridge, covering Bengal in all its vivid colors.
ये आपकी रक्षा के लिए और ये आपकी रक्षा के लिए।
अरे ये क्या है?
ये आपकी रक्षा के लिए और ये घर की रक्षा के लिए।
न जले न पिघले, घर घर को सेफ बनाएं। अपार अणुशक्ति फायर प्रोटेक्ट वायर।
The NDTV Yuva Conclave returns. An unstoppable wave of brilliance. Celebrating Yuva from every field and the disruptors shaping the future. Join us only on NDTV 24/7.
He sold most of his stock, 80%, as on that date.
We have requested
the management to come and speak to us. They asked us, what questions will you ask? We've sent it to them. They don't want to answer it, so then let's put it to our viewers as well.
7 key questions, right? How is it that 2,000 crore goes unnoticed by all of these auditors?
SEBI is seeking more information on the trades and the, all the transaction which has happened from the exchanges, both NSE and BSE.
The Reserve Bank of India's supervisory officers, they are seeking compliance reports on their foreign currency borrowings by these banks.
The DSS is, actively engaging with the Reserve Bank of India to sort of ensure the thorough examination of the matter. And
IndusInd Bank, as part of its internal review, had found that certain aspects of its derivatives portfolio was not meeting the standard that was set by the Reserve Bank of India.
The India-US strategic partnership is one that's been developing now over the last several decades, and there's a great sense of optimism over here in India that it is headed in a particular direction. To tell us a little bit about that, and there are so many important global events taking place, Tulsi Gabbard with us, the Director of National Intelligence. It's wonderful to have you here in India, and thank you so much for speaking to us. In terms of the strategic relationship and the intelligence arrangements between India and the United States, to what extent is it premised on perhaps an expansionist or an expanding China and the Asia-Pacific region?
You know, the ties between our two countries, the United
Welcome back. Now, high voltage meeting drama that took place in Vidhan Sabha of Maharashtra, presided by a speaker, regarding Mumbai road, construction works, as Aditya Thackeray and the Deputy Chief Minister Eknath Shinde came face to face. Eknath Shinde, the Guardian Minister of Mumbai, who was specially the speaker to review report on the road works, Aditya Thackeray demanded to the Assembly Speaker for a probe by Economic Offences Wing in the presence of Eknath Shinde. So both, remember, both of them used to be from one political party, where the erstwhile Shiv Sena, which broke Eknath Shinde, now in fact has the, as per them, the real Shiv Sena, and the symbol and the name has been granted to his faction. Aditya Thackeray is the son of Uddhav Thackeray from the Shiv Sena, Uddhav Thackeray. Both these leaders came face to face on the Mumbai road and construction work taking place in the city. Aditya Thackeray has been quite aggressive and has demanded Economic Offences Wing to in fact investigate the construction work. Let me go across to my colleague Abhishek, who is joining us with more details on this. Is there some allegation of a wrongdoing that Aditya Thackeray wants EOW to investigate, Abhishek?
Definitely, this is not the first time that this demand has been come up, but now the collective demand has grown, has come up, because on 21st of March, that is Friday, collectively, whether the MLAs of opposition or ruling, along with Aditya Thackeray inside the House in Maharashtra Assembly, they have raised this issue, and Speaker has convened an important meeting today. And being a Guardian Minister and Urban Development Minister, Eknath Shinde was also called, who briefed that what work has been done till now, and it was not satisfactory.